Kushi coming at you guys again with another basics guide or I guess discussion about my thoughts on Scholar. So again, whenever it comes to this, as usual, it's not going to be extremely detailed. This is just going to be a couple tips, a few things that you could do for Scholar, or some things that you do need to know that makes things easier either for you or for your party as a whole. Now, just very quickly, I will go ahead and go over one thing that's extremely important because we are a healer, the healer role. So, priority for healing is yourself, the tank, and everyone else. Make sure that you specifically are alive. Then make sure that your tank is alive, especially as of Endwalker, because as of Endwalker, all of the tanks are almost entirely self-reliant. They don't really need you that much, but there are such things as mistakes, and there are things that do require the healer to have an active role. Now, with that said, I'll also bring up another point. Scholar and Sage are quote-unquote healers, but they are barrier healers, and as a rule of thumb, I always try to separate the thought process of a barrier healer and a pure healer. A barrier healer would be more of a damage preventer as opposed to a direct healer, because their job, instead of reacting to damage by healing someone, they are supposed to preemptively prepare for the damage to come in. That's why they typically get things such as not that, but Fey Illumination, which would be, it's a raid wide. So, that right there is a raid wide mitigation. So that's their raid buff. Because the thing about Scholar is that it's in a really good position in the fact that it has several raid buffs that it's able to use. Now, when I say raid buffs, buff it doesn't necessarily mean damage. A raid wide is anything, or rather a raid buff basically would be anything that buffs or benefits the party, in which case Scholar has several. It would have Fey Illumination, which is a complete game changer, because it reduces the damage that everyone takes by 5%. So that's not a lot, and it is only magical damage, so it would go for raid wide boss damage typically, because typically raid wides are magical. There are some that are physical, so not all the time will that work, but that's also why it increases healing from all nearby party members by 10%. Now keep in mind that only applies specifically to I believe only GCDs. So anything that is a GCD or a spell would have the increased healing, because that's, for instance, how emergency tactics would work. How it turns your next Adloquium or your next Sucker, I believe, or rather it transforms the next Galvanize and Catalyze into like full heals. But we'll go ahead and work our way up there. So the most important thing obviously is Eos and Selene. Now, there used to be a difference between the two, but now it's pure static. It literally has no difference. Just make sure that you have one summoned at all times. And in terms of damage output, I will go ahead and say that you are a healer, but do need to deal damage, Scholar is really, really good at damage. The only problem is that it's not very complex, and this is more of a healer issue just in general, because they don't have like actual rotation to do. They just have one dot and you know, like one spell and then one AoE. One single target spell and one AoE spell. Now the problem with Scholar is that it is the only one in the game that only has one AoE, which is Art of War and Art of War 2. Now don't get me wrong, Art of War 2 is actually really good, and it is one of the few damage types, or rather it's one of the few damaging spells or, you know, weapon skills that actually is a gain on two targets. So if there are two targets, using Art of War over Broil is a damage gain, so you want to do that, as opposed to using Broil on each one of them, or just Biolysis and Broil. You want to use Art of War instead. Now, another tip or another idea is to be wary of your party members during full 8-man content. So in certain instances there will be certain attacks that, you know, the white mage with their level 90 ability, Liturgy of the Bell. Now because they put a band-aid on this instead of actually fixing the main core issue with Liturgy of the Bell, Scholar still has to be careful. You know, Sage still has to be careful when they're giving shields to the party, because if you put a shield on a white mage, it stops them from taking damage, which would stop the effect from going off on their bell, which makes the uses go down, which overall would be less healing. So that's something to watch out for, and please, you know, be careful and be aware of, you know, who you're giving the barriers to and what for. Now another thing to look out for is your gauge. Your gauge, which is your fairy gauge, will actually build up, we'll actually do it here. Whenever you use your ether flow abilities, it builds up by 10. We're just using this because it's easier. And then afterwards, what is actually a good idea, you know, after you've built some gauge, is if you don't feel like healing your tank, you actually can use the new skill that came out, and this is actually one of the few things that I, you know, really like that they changed, and I wish that they would do this to more abilities. But Protraction is basically a lesser version of Warrior's Thrill of Battle. Well, it will increase the maximum HP of a party member or the person target, basically anyone who's targeted, and then it increases HP recovery via healing actions. So that specific wording means that it does not have to be a spell or a weapon skill that specifically triggers it. Say for instance you're using Fey Illumination. Fey Illumination only increases healing magic potency. So that would mean that it only works for GCD abilities, or your spells, the ones with the recast time and cast times. The same as Dissipation, which again is why Dissipation is bad. In fact, this ability, I wouldn't even say to use this. In fact, I would strongly recommend to not use it unless you 100% know what you're doing, because by using Dissipation, you're getting rid of your fairy. You're getting rid of the fairy, and that's not something that you want to do, because they, you know, have, you know, really good healing. You know, you can't cast Fey Illumination, you can't cast Fey Blessing, you can't use Whispering Dawn, you can't use Ether Pack, you can't use anything. You'll be able to use some of your Ether Flow abilities, but outside of that, you won't be able to do much. So if you're ever having a problem with healing your tank, always, take the preemptive measures and, prepare before a fight. Whenever a fight's about to happen, the first thing you always do is throw up Add Low on your tank, and then combo that with Excogitation, which is actually a good buff. It's amazing. I love it. It will actually grant a buff to the targeted person, and whenever their HP dips below 50%, it will automatically heal them for 800 potency. And that is amazing to actually have, because you can do crazy things like combining Adloquium as a barrier, and then you can place Sacred Soil, which is an AoE that actually is basically a big barrier that makes everyone have 10% damage mitigation, and it heals whoever's inside of it, so it makes your barrier harder to pop, and your tank is being healed while they're standing in it. And then if you really want to get them on top, you can throw Protraction on them to increase their healing even more that they receive from the Sacred Soil, and then throw Ether Pact on them, which will actually make your fairy tether to the targeted person and give them a good chunk of healing, which is why we call Scholar like the lazy healer, because realistically Scholar does not heal anyone. It's really just the fairy. You don't do anything. The only thing you're there for is damage. That's really the only reason that you would do that. Now, the other thing that Scholar has going for it, like I said, is utility. So Scholar is the only one that actually has a complete alliance-wide like buff, or rather debuff. You're able to put Chain Stratagem on targets, and it makes them take technically more damage. Basically, it increases everyone's crit rate, on that particular target by 10%. There are advantages and disadvantages to this. A warrior, for instance, cannot use that buff. A samurai, for instance, cannot use that buff. Those are really the only two that I can immediately think of, and which is why I still say that those two need to be looked at, because, again, remember, the wording says that it increases crit rate, but with samurai, with machinist, and with warrior, their damage, their burst damage comes from automatic crits, which is guaranteed to crit, so it increases crit rate but not crit damage. So basically, if you have a party that has a samurai, a warrior, and a machinist, technically this won't do very much for them. For the machinist, it'll do a little bit, but I would recommend that you wait until after everybody's burst phase and then activate this, because you'll be wasting it, because their stuff already kind of crits, so you can't really do anything about it. Now let's touch on a few more topics here, because I don't want to keep jumping around and making things harder to understand. Ether Flow, I don't know, there's not much to say about Ether Flow. Ether Flow is a good ability. Typically you want to go ahead and make sure that you always don't, again, like with warrior, that it really applies to all jobs, but do not waste your gauge. If you have an Ether Flow stack still, please use it, so that way when you use this you get the full effect of all of this, because by wasting any of these you're wasting your gauge, and by wasting this gauge you have less healing, which increases the chances of screwing up, Now, it happens every now and then, and you know, I catch myself sometimes doing it because it's just a reflex for me to press that button when it's available. But make sure that you at least dump whatever gauge you have. If you really have to use energy drain, I wouldn't recommend energy drain because energy drain is just a bad ability. It's just bad. Like, it's not even worth using because the problem was is that with Endwalker, they did not account for Broil doing as much damage as it does and the cast time being lower. You actually cannot weave energy drains into broils really anymore. So like you're able to do this, but as soon as I hit the button, you know, like the cast time is so low. Like there's no reason. Like, and it's not like you can't move. You can move while casting. You just have to do it within a certain period. If you go within, I believe it's 0.2 seconds. Once you hit 0.2 seconds, you can move. So there's not really a point to broil anymore. Or rather, there's not really a point into energy drain anymore because the ability doesn't do anything. It doesn't do enough damage. It's too low. It doesn't give you mana anymore. They took away the mana gain and put it all into ether flow, which is why it restores 20% now as opposed to what, 10% it was before? It was 10%, and then energy drain would give you 500 mana for every one that you used. So it had a use before. Now it's just a button that's just kind of there that shouldn't ever really be used because there's not really a use for it. There's not really a use for it, so I mean, there's not much to say besides, you know, just be aware, I guess, of what's going on. Scholar is in a good spot because it's got, you know, all the raid-wide buffs. Again, it's got, you know, all the regions. It's got Fey Illumination, which is a good 5% damage mitigation on a raid-wide, excuse me. Typically that would be magic damage only though, but you know, around maybe I'd say 70% of raid-wide damage is going to be magical unless it's going to be physical, in which case if you're aware of that, just use Sucker instead. You won't notice the difference. And then on top of that, another thing that makes Scholar really good, and you know, it's my favorite ability in the game, and I hate that it got nerfed, is Expedient. I don't know why they won't just call it speed, like just spell ESPEED. Just say expedient, because like that's literally what it is, moving really fast. I love it though. It's a really good ability, you know, for a 90, like, because it has multiple uses. It doesn't just have one use, and it's better than Fey Illumination, which has a 120-second cooldown. This has 120 as well, but it increases movement speed by, you know, by basically making everyone have sprint. It basically is sprint level speed, but it also reduces all incoming damage by 10% as opposed to just only magical or just only physical. It reduces all incoming damage. So this is the button that you want to press whenever, you know, things like that happen. And again, that's why I keep saying, you know, really Scholar is like the lazy healer, because you're not doing anything. You're just activating, you know, abilities every now and then, and it's the fairy that's actually doing most of the healing for you. Because, you know, you've got your gauge, your fairy gauge, and your ether flow gauge. This is where your healing is. You shouldn't really be using physic, and you'll be using Adloquium, but the only reason or the only way you'd be using Adloquium is to fish for procs, or if the tank is taking damage and you're trying to throw, you know, a barrier on them. And I've seen this multiple times, and this, I'm glad that I actually talked about that. Whenever someone is taking damage, more specifically the tank, and you know they're dipping in health and you're trying to heal them, do not only spam Adloquium and override your shield over and over again, because you're wasting, you know, the effect, and you know they aren't getting healed as quick. What is a good habit to do is stop, take a look at the tank's health and make sure that they are okay. Use recitation, because it's quite literal, and it explains what it's going to do. So what recitation does is it grants you the ability to use Adloquium, Succor, Indomitability, or Excogitation without using resources. Meaning if you use any of your, fairy gauge abilities with this active, it actually won't take a gauge use. It won't use this gauge, or if you use this, it actually doesn't use mana. So a good idea is to use recitation and throw up an Adlo on them, and it also guarantees that it will crit. Now, a crit barrier is, instead of it being a galvanize, it's a catalyze. Catalyze is a big, big barrier that basically will stop anything from taking damage. Now, after you do that, you've got your barrier as a filter between the damage and your target's HP. Now, while that filter is up and the barrier is taking damage and their health is going up, you need to activate emergency tactics, because that's what this was for. It will transform the next galvanize or catalyze status, meaning that it can still crit. It will turn it into just pure healing. So this is the instance where it's, borrows from the other side, of healing, and just turns it into a pure heal, hence the name emergency tactics. Basically, you put up this barrier, and once you put up that barrier as the filter, you use this, and it turns your barriers into just direct healing, so that way you can get their HP up, which is really good. It's a really good thing to do. And I've seen some people ignore this, or some people not understand it, but that would be the way that you'll do it. And I will actually try to showcase it in a dungeon. Hopefully things shouldn't go wrong with this, because typically the way that it'll work is, I'm the healer, so nothing can really go wrong, because I'm the one that's healing. And we got a dungeon, hopefully, it's a level 71, and no spoilers at all. But I'll just showcase a bit of what I'm talking about, and you'll get like a good feel for what I'm saying. I am kind of geared, so it probably will just be mostly me just standing around and not really doing anything. Oh good, we got a level 61, so yeah, I'll probably be just standing around, not really doing very much. Yeah, I usually typically use that with them, because I feel comfortable using Swift Cast, because don't be afraid to do that, by the way. Swift Cast is just really good, and it's always a good idea to do so. There's no reason really not to use it. So again, taking damage, so I'm going to put the barrier up. And that's the filter. They mostly received all of their healing, so they don't really have to worry about anything. So I guess my emergency tactics is really just sitting there, but that was a just in case. It's got such a low cooldown. Don't be afraid to use it, because it's only 15 seconds. You won't even notice it. You really won't even notice it. But as you see, like I'm not really doing very much. Like, the dungeon's going pretty smooth, and you know, I'm not really having to do much of anything. Like, all that I'm doing is just mostly dealing damage. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm placing buffs, you know, on them, but for the most part, everything's taken care of for them. And then we'll use also, you know, deployment tactics. Deployment tactics is really good because that's another raid-wide buff that, you know, they would have available. What it does is it takes the barrier of the initial target that you use it on, and it makes it spread to everyone. So it's a good way to save mana because it stops you from having to put shields on everyone and instead just giving everyone really big shields. Also be wary of Ruin 2. Ruin 2 also doesn't really have a use because it has the same problem as, you know, energy drain, because Broil has such a low cast time, it's not even really worth it to use anything except for just Broil. Now, unless you're forced to move, you don't really have to. Tank is taking a little bit of damage here. Let me get over to their side. Again, we're just mostly still, you know, dealing damage. I'm not really doing anything. That's one of the rare instances, and then we're gonna get right back to it. Whenever you're doing tech, like, you know, any, you know, advanced movement or advanced tactics, you know, you do want to throw in an energy drain, just so that way, at the very least, I don't feel like I'm wasting my gauge. Because I'd rather, if everyone's at full, there's no problem with using it, don't get me wrong. There's no problem with using it, you know, in the event that you're trying to get, like, extra damage in. Now, in my opinion, they do need to increase Ruin 2's damage, but make it cost, like, more mana. Like, if they did that, that would be amazing. Or if they gave an augment to Ruin 2 to make it like a Ruin 5, like how Summoner has. So that way, you know, it's like a new AoE ability. That would be good. I feel like it would be in a really good position. Alright, so we're gonna throw that up. And here's what we're gonna do. Remember, put the barrier as the filter, and then while they're taking damage, heal them. Okay, there we go. I'll remove that burn off of them. Make sure that they're good and healed, and then just go back to dealing damage. Hence why I keep saying that it is, you know, really the lazy healer. Because, you know, it really doesn't do very much, and I'm not really doing a lot of healing. I'm just commanding the Fae to do it for me. Or I'm using the Fae's power to do it for me. Now, in emergency situations, there is no problem though with using dissipation. I just still think that, you know, a pet using, you know, job should not have something that dispels the pet, and you get very minimal, like, benefit. Up we go. And again, remember, your whole ordeal is just to make sure that everyone lives. That's all that, you know, your goal is. Just to make sure that people live. Also positioning. Position your fairy, typically in the center of arenas, unless you've got, you know, new people or returning individuals that are really, really far away. So I would recommend that you do know what each of the commands do. It's typically a good idea to know what each one of those do, just so that way you have a good idea as to what's going on with that. Raid wide damage incoming. Right, make sure everyone's good and barriered. I remember this mechanic, we have to go to the same... No, we can't go to the same one. Why you do this? I'm supposed to feel special. But with that one, yeah, you're supposed to match up your symbol. See, they aren't. They took a Vuln stat. If I had a shield on them, they probably may not have taken one. Though they probably would have, because I don't have any way to give them really good barriers guaranteed. Oh, I love that helmet. I want that. I can use that. Valkyrie's helm offending? Oh, it can't be dyed. I don't care, I still want it. And then remember, while you guys are standing around, oh, boom, you fish for those catalyze procs. So that way it makes your job easier and it makes the tank's job easier. Because remember, as I said in the tanking video for Warrior, whenever you're activating mitigations and you have a barrier on yourself, you're making that barrier harder to pop. So you're basically giving the barrier more value. So definitely don't be afraid to throw the barriers up preemptively on a tank. They don't need to be put on them in combat, they need to be put on them before combat begins, so that way they get more of a use out of it. We are level 16, so we're not able to do much of the laziness, but for the most part it's really there because Celine is still just kind of doing everything for me, and I don't really have to do anything. So I'm not really doing much. Remember, Art of War is a gain on 2. If there are 2 targets on your screen, do not be using single target abilities. Be using Art of War. You do more damage by using your AoE. Again, preemptively before combat begins, just so that way that barrier gets some use. Throw up Whispering Dawn, so that way he gets some regen. Throw that up. Get my mana back. That's the other thing. You need a lot of mana discipline when it comes to playing a healer. It is really important that you have mana discipline, and if you lack mana discipline, there actually is a way around that, because I had the same issue until I fixed it preemptively. But having more piety will actually increase obviously it increases your mana regen. You'll do less damage obviously if you have more piety, but again, if you're having problems with mana, I would rather do less damage than not be able to keep everyone alive because I couldn't keep my mana and everyone's dead. So I would definitely recommend doing that instead. We've got 2 vuln stacks, and I'm for sure that's magical damage. Yeah. These should go away, I believe, pretty quickly. It's not that big of a deal. Oh yeah, I remember the Strix. I remember this. All right. I did not get hit by the AoE. And those are going to be that right there, which during the properties of quakes, you want to use these for levitation. Get up here. Damn, I tried to stop them from taking damage, and I did not. Don't be afraid to rescue someone if they really don't look like they know what they're doing, or if they're just returning. Okay, so this will leaden us, so that way we're heavy, so the tornado can't move us. Make sure we use that. Properties of imps, we're going to get turned into imps, and we need to use the pool to turn back. They're Lala, so I can't even tell the difference between the two. Again, make sure people stay alive. People make mistakes, and that's okay. Everyone has to start somewhere. That's why I like being the healer. I can, see, what people are doing, so that way I can tell exactly what the problem. Oh yeah, that's right. The behemoth is here, and he's gonna use meteor. Which we need to shield for, so shield up. We need to get over there before it hits the ground, or that is a one-hit kill. I think he'll die. Should die before it hits the ground. See, here we go. It's a GG's. Yeah, it's just the basics though. Huh. I might use that coat. I certainly like the way it looks. Oh, and I got all three comms. That's I didn't really even do anything. They mostly did that. But yeah, that's just, basics. Just very quickly, I'll go ahead and talk about a few more things that you saw me do in there that I suddenly remembered. So when it comes to what is it that I was using? I was using something, deployment tactics, right. So deployment tactics is an oddball, and I don't see very many people use it. Please do use it, because it's actually really helpful. Typically, a good idea is that whenever you use Sucker will actually give everyone, a 160% barrier, which is like that small little shield, but it's AoE, so everyone gets it. What deployment tactics does is that it will extend the galvanize effect onto other people. So in other words, if they have an adloquium shield, which is at base 180% as opposed to the 160%, this plus this is stronger than just this. So Adloquium plus deployment tactics is stronger than just Sucker. Or if you want to get really technical, you could use recitation to make your Adloquium automatically catalyze, which is a crit barrier, and then use deployment tactics to spread that crit barrier to everyone, so that way everyone has it, which makes it much stronger than Sucker, and then throw Expedient on top of it, and basically you've got a really big barrier that's on top of everyone that now has 10% mitigation. So that's a really, really good thing to have. And the only downside to playing Scholar is you only have one AoE. So during other stuff, you're going to be kind of bored for a bit. I mean, again, I like it because I like being able to do other things. The only problem is again, I do want something else besides just Art of War. And Ruin 2 is going to have to be looked at, and Energy Drain is going to have to be looked at. But everything else is completely fine. And I love the way that they scaled the new healing, because I remember when Fey Blessing used to be so bad because it had no healing on it. It literally had no healing on it and would not heal at all. Now it has really good healing, because I remember it used to take gauge to use it, and that gauge was not worth using. But now, since it's free and the potency is 320, and healing, you know, calculation is different. It's much better than before. And in this case, you know, instead of using Dissipation, because Dissipation actually is just, you know, I don't even understand why this is even still in the game. They need to rework this severely. Instead of using Dissipation as your panic button, just use Summon Seraph, which will actually summon Seraph to fight by your side. It will replace your fairy with the Seraph. The problem that I feel with Seraph is that Seraph is good, but Seraph isn't good enough, if that makes sense. Because like whenever you summon Seraph, it turns everything. It turns Whispering Dawn and Fey Illumination into different skills, but they don't do anything different. So you have Angel's Whisper, which is 21 seconds. Let me look, because I actually have yet to look at this. Yeah, see? Orders the fairy, I keep saying because it is a fairy, it's not fairy, it's fairy technically, but it orders the fairy to execute Whispering Dawn, and if it's under Seraph, then it does Angel's Whisper. But there's not really there's not a difference between Angel's Whisper, which is a heal over time at 80 potency for 21 seconds, and this being a heal potency for 80 for 21 seconds. See, these are the same, they just have different names. This needs to be stronger than this, in my opinion, because yes, you have Constellation, but this should be better. This should be massively better, and this should be massively better. At least make this 10% mitigation. Yes, I know we have the 10% already, but this is just sort of, I don't understand why you're not able to use it. And then you can't use Fey Union with Seraph either, which is really strange. I'm not sure as to why they made that decision, because you can use every ability still except for Fey Union and Fey Blessing, because you can't use Fey Blessing. Or rather, not that one. I know, yeah, Fey Blessing. You're not able to use that either, which is really strange. I'm not sure as to, you know, what happened with that. Because again, it's just kind of there, and you'd figure that you'd be able to do that. But you know, I guess that's just me. I'm rambling at this point. You know, that pretty much is it. You know, I've showed you the examples, and Scholar's a really good job. But I mean, shoot, that's scholar. If you have any questions, ask directly, and I'll be happy to answer. But overall, the job is really good, and I would recommend it to anyone as their first barrier healer, because it's much more easier than Sage, because Sage does not allow a lot of room for error. Uh, so I would say, 10 out of, well, not 10 out of 10, but I'd say a good 7 out of 10, because there are abilities that need to be reworked or redesigned. Um, well, I guess that's it. There's not really much else to say. Hopefully you have a good one. I appreciate you watching.